Hey everybody, it's CVH here, and today we'll be talking about the mid-range warrior deck that you can see on screen. And I wanted to talk about this deck for a couple of reasons. One, as with a lot of my deck techs, this is the deck that I've been playing recently on stream, and I've recorded a couple of videos, highlights of the stream particularly, showcasing it, so I'd like to go through and sort of give you an idea of the individual card choices, even though you've probably already seen the list if you've seen me play it before, a little bit more of an in-depth analysis. And I made a recent video, is another reason, about basically the classes I encountered on my grind to Legend from rank 5 this season, and Warrior was among the lowest represented alongside Monk and Assassin, and like those kind of things. So basically, and Crusader. Crusader was down there too. But Warrior is a kind of a class where if you're not playing orcs, a dedicated orc strategy with or some fringe control deck, there aren't really too many options on the ladder, and this is sort of an updated version of a deck that people had been playing previously, and I sort of wanted to revisit it and maybe make it relevant if you guys wanted to play some warrior decks. This is potentially an option. I did peak at top 5 legend with this deck. I haven't attempted to grind further yet, but I've had a pretty good win rate with it on the legend ladder against other top decks. So yeah, I wanted to kind of revisit the strategy. It actually kind of started out as just something to mess around with. I didn't expect it to do as well as it had done on the ladder. So I basically decided I would, build something rather experimental. Maybe if we get to the bottom of Legend, we get to the bottom of Legend. If we get to the top, we get to the top. As it turned out, we got a lot closer to the top than the bottom. So that being said, I'd like to go through it and sort of give you my thoughts on the specific card choices. This is basically as curve-oriented as a deck can possibly be in Elder Scrolls Legends. I'd say even more so than Sorcerer, sort of reminiscent of the old mid-range Archer decks, if you guys are familiar with that. Potentially even faster with more density of threats at all points in the curve. Basically, this deck wants to take advantage of anything slower than it. It wants to beat up on the control decks. It wants to curve under other mid-range decks. As a result, it can suffer somewhat against aggro, but there are tech choices that it could include that I'm maybe not including all of, that we can talk about at the end of the video, card choices that aren't in the deck that maybe could fit into the deck. So this deck is going to be looking to play the best possible thing it can play at every point in the game, basically. And besides that, the hardest parts of playing this deck are knowing when to trade, when to go face, etc., how to allocate your resources there. But playing the right card in your hand is usually the easy part. Just play the thing that's largest, or the most value that you can see on the board. So we start at the bottom of the curve as always. Iliac Sorcerer, and what's up with the Iliac Sorcerer? So people ask me if this card was actually that good in the deck, and I've come to the conclusion that it's actually pretty central to this particular deck. So going at face value, we have a 1-drop 1/1 with Ward. It's already pretty resilient, doesn't have the most power, yet it does trade well since it has Ward with many of the things you might see in an aggro deck. So it does help you in early game against that, and against those control strategies, it's going to be sort of picking away at the life, which, as we'll talk about when it comes to certain cards that I'm sure you're already familiar with in this deck, being ahead in life is relevant for this deck, as with many of the mid-range decks in the meta currently. It's also important to note that in recent metagame trends, Ramp Scout and Midrange Archer, two previously incredibly popular decks, have sort of fallen off, at least a little bit. Maybe not entirely, but at least a little bit, and with them falling off, has fallen off Murkwater Witch, which is probably the single best counter to Iliac Sorcerer. So that incredibly powerful swing doesn't happen as often for your opponent, and yeah, of course, Iliac Sorcerer can still get executed, but execute, it feels much better to trade 1-for-1 with an execute than simply get -1 when your opponent plays Murkwater Witch. All of a sudden, this card is there, and if they use execute on the Iliac Sorcerer, all of a sudden they don't have the execute for any number of other things you could be playing later that could get executed, so it's actually pretty much okay for you. And if it sticks, of course, we have a lot of ways in this deck that I'll talk about. We actually sort of built, not necessarily around the Iliac Sorcerer, but as it turns out, a lot of the cards that we want to play in this sort of strategy work incredibly well with the Iliac Sorcerer. So we can buff it up with a card like Steel Scimitar, for example, and then if the ward gets popped, it becomes much larger than a 2/1. It becomes potentially a 6 attack, or even larger. It can get very, very large in this deck. So oftentimes your opponent's going to be looking to execute it or even use other removal on it because they treat it as such of a potential threat, and rightfully so in some situations as well. So another 1-drop in the deck. That's the only 1-drop creature, obviously, but we're moving on to Rapid Shot, and Rapid Shot is kind of the versatile action this deck really wants to have. It's good against aggro, it's good sometimes against control, and it's even good in some combo situations. One reason this card is in there, and one reason I also included in the original version Sharpshooter Scout. I'll talk about another reason I included that in a little bit, but Sharpshooter Scout used to be in the deck. Rapid Shot is in the deck, and one of the reasons is, outside of its normal utility of simply dealing 1 damage to one of your opponent's creatures, it's also a very easy card to ping your own Iliac Sorcerer. You even cycle when you do so, so it can sort of give you that activator. If you're sitting on a buffed up, warded Iliac Sorcerer, your opponent might be thinking to themselves, okay, that's kind of annoying, but as long as I move my creatures into the other lane, I don't have to interact with it, and my opponent's not going to be able to dump a huge amount of attack on me. Rapid Shot allows you to proactively get rid of your own ward on the Iliac Sorcerer that's buffed, on your own terms, on your own turn, so you can then attack with it immediately afterwards, all the while you're cycling. And that is not, I don't mean to say that's a scenario that happens a lot, obviously, it's pretty unique as a scenario goes, that all of that would come together at the right time in your hand and on the board, and be the correct play past that. But Rapid Shot, as I mentioned, is a very versatile action. It's good against the aggro decks. It can ping things off if you're making trade plays, and you do have to frequently trade against certain decks in the meta when something's particularly threatening. Rapid Shot can help you do that by trading up with a 2 attack into a 3 health card by, cycling as well. Very powerful, and in the late game, you never really hate drawing it as long as you can cycle. And if you're top decking, it's frequently correct to cycle on your own creatures if possible. Steel Scimitar, basically one of the most powerful items this deck could be playing. Very efficient way to make something that your opponent maybe was discounting on the board or trying to ignore very powerful at a very with a very cost-efficient card. Steel Scimitar on an Iliac Sorcerer very early. If your opponent was trying to contest with some 2-3 or something like that, I don't know, 2-2, 2-3, all of a sudden, you basically win that lane immediately. It becomes incredibly hard to come back for your opponent. They're going to have to spend resources. All of a sudden, they're very far behind on tempo, and it only really costs you 1 Magicka. So the only downside to this card, really, is that you have to have a creature on board, but this deck is so incredibly creature-focused that it's not really a bad inclusion. It's not really a dead card, basically, ever. And a lot of the cards in this deck sort of function similarly because we have so many creatures, we run so many buff cards. So moving on to the 2-drops, we have basically what you probably would consider some obvious inclusions. We have Dragontail Savior. It's resilient early game. It's pretty powerful because it doesn't get straight up firebolted, and that's nice against some of the control decks, and basically any deck that's in blue is playing Firebolt except for Aggro Battle Mage, so that's just nice by itself. And later in the game, if your opponent's trying to race you, particularly in the shadow lane, you can dump Dragontail Savior down, make it a 4-3, 5-3, just gets pretty large all of a sudden, and your opponent's not going to be able to attack it immediately, so it can sort of seal some race situations if they don't have immediate answers for it. Very powerful 2-drop, nothing really new there. Greystone Ravager, now this is a card that you would see in the Orc versions of Warrior because it's a very powerful Orc. Turns out it's just good enough as a 2-drop in the deck to be played regardless of not really having any Orc synergy in this particular deck. 4-1 with Prophecy. This is another card that would be not very happy to be Murkwater Witched if that were seeing a whole lot of play. It does pack a hell of a punch for a 2-drop, and as a Prophecy, it's incredibly swingy against any other deck that's going to be attacking you, and there are quite a few of those in the metagame currently. Windkeep Spellsword, the be-all end-all 2-drop, super huge value, so we play it as a 3-of. And the last 2-drop in the deck is a U-Shield. So this is a tech card. I originally did not include Nogleave in the list because I felt like it was a little bit too slow, and as we get into the top of the curve, I'll sort of touch on that a little bit more about what the game plan generally is to end the game on turn 7 against a lot of the slower decks. Nogleave, of course, is very versatile, and it maybe should even be in the deck, possibly over the U-Shield, but I did want to include this because this is the particular version that I grinded with, so I wanted to sort of give it to you card for card, and not switch out cards before the deck tech, even though I considered mentioning the Nogleave instead of the U-Shield. So U-Shield gives the creature guard and +1/+1 for each enemy creature in this lane. I included this because I did, in fact, think this deck, even with the sharpshooters that were in the original version, might be weak to aggro. So this is sort of the tech against that, because we have a lot of wards, we have a lot of, pretty large things. We have, young mammoths, just things that are really good at racing. So I decided that maybe our opponent's trying to race us in the same lane. We just put a U-Shield on some big creature, and all of a sudden it sort of becomes a roadblock for them, while it allows us to also have reach, because if our opponent's trying to contest in the same lane, it can function as an overcosted Steel Scimitar in a pinch, so it hasn't disappointed me so far. This is a card I do encourage you to go out and test. I haven't gotten enough testing to be totally comfortable with it, but I think it's an underrated card for sure, and I think it potentially does fit in this deck. And, like I mentioned, of course, it's another thing that buffs the Iliac Sorcerer as well. I don't mean to keep touching on that like it's the focus of the deck, because it's not, but U-Shield is a pretty versatile card. If you play it correctly against aggro, it can be very hard for them to basically bypass you, at least in that lane. So moving on to the 3-drops. Basically the sweet Haunting Spirit, Young Mammoth, and Morkel Gatekeeper. This deck is very good at keeping the board. I want to touch on what was it? It was the Withered Hand Cultist. This is a card that I didn't include. I kind of want to talk about why I didn't include it really quick, because you might be asking yourself that question. I know I included it in the aggro archer deck. So we do have a few actions: Rapid Shot and the Midnight Sweep. Midnight Sweep is attack against those aggro decks, of course. Rapid Shot could be sort of replaced by Sharpshooter Scout, and then we could potentially play the Withered Hand Cultist. It's not so much that it interacts negatively with our actions, because actions aren't really the focus of the deck. It's that Withered Hand Cultist helps in the aggro archer deck, because that deck really needs to keep the board in the first few turns so it can deal enough damage to burst the opponent down later, and it's kind of hard to do so because a lot of the cards it plays are fragile. Not the case in this deck. The cards, if there is a word to describe them, it's definitely not fragile. As we can see with the 3-drops that we can get into now. Young Mammoth, huge, very threatening. Haunting Spirit, huge, very threatening. These 6 cards right here give the deck such a sturdy, sort of a backbone in the curve that they can rely on. So it's very easy to just sort of, once you get ahead in this deck, it's very easy to stay ahead. It's very hard for your opponent to efficiently answer anything, because everything is so difficult to answer if you've had any sort of a good start. Of course, this deck also plays from behind a little poorly, and once it gets behind, you're just playing one thing a turn. They're really good things, but you can get raced if you lose the board early. But these cards, if you played something that, you have a 2-drop, your opponent doesn't have a 2-drop, you play one of these, and the game is almost effectively over at that point. Morkel Gatekeeper, a little bit more of a less impactful on-curve play a lot of the time, but very versatile for the deck. Gives it another prophecy that it desperately needs against those other aggressive decks, and the buff in this deck is incredibly welcome. It gives the deck more reach. We don't really have charge too much in this deck besides the Markarth that I'll talk about in a bit, but we do have a good amount of reach thanks to all the ways to buff creatures in the deck. Earthbone Spinner, fantastic card, don't really need to talk about it too much. One of the best silences in the game, probably the most efficient answer to Gardener of Swords, which is relevant currently. Lumbering Ogrim's in there as another thing that packs a punch, basically. It's Young Mammoth's older brother, I guess, even though it's definitely not a Mammoth. Definitely the other Mammoth card is a more apt comparison there, but Ogrim is just pretty huge. The only downside of this card is that it gets lightning bolted, and it's not that huge of a deal, honestly. And if it gets lightning bolted, then potentially the Markarth Bannerman you play next turn does not get lightning bolted, and that's actually okay a lot of the time, even though you're missing out on that great 7 damage swing. Midnight Sweep, already talked about it, fantastic against aggro. It's sort of, you could say it's in there over Preserver of the Root. They could both be in the same list, of course. I felt the Preserver of the Root, it could actually be in there over the Ogrim. They both get lightning bolted, so it feels the same when you don't get to attack with either of them. Preserver of the Root, while it's great later in the game when it can become a 6/6, I felt like we already had enough threats later in the game. We're not particularly looking to guard most of the time later in the game, and it just felt a little too slow for what the deck was trying to do in my eyes. Of course, it's a totally reasonable card because it has a lot of value, though. But Midnight Sweep, I felt, was more adequate for what a role the deck needed to have filled, which was a little bit of defense and making the board a little wider. Reeve Blade Master, ever since it got buffed to a 3/5, I think I mentioned this in the Aggro Archer deck tech as well. Just a fantastic card. Another one of those kind of hard to deal with cards for the time you're dropping it. Unlike Ogrim, it's even harder to deal with, and it can push a lot of damage if left unchecked. Markarth Bannerman. Now, this is another card that you might be questioning, another one that you've seen in the Aggro Archer deck tech, because there were a lot of ways to buff the Nords in that deck, and on first glance you're like, well, this deck doesn't have Northwind Outpost, or Clan Captain, or Hidden Trail, so why are you playing this card, period? And the answer would be because we actually, first of all, the Nords have utility in that they can be removal as well. Next to Rapid Shot, that can allow you to ping off a lot of different things if you're trying to race your opponent. Very powerful in that respect, but we also do have a lot of ways to actually buff them. Just having one Nord that you save in your hand after Markarth makes a lot of the cards in this deck that could be the worst draws in your deck actually very live, like Steel Scimitar. All of a sudden, this just becomes 3 damage, because you can just plop it on a 1/1 Nord Firebrand, immediately convert the Steel Scimitar into damage. Savage Ogre, we'll talk about that in a minute. It's very, very powerful, but when you're playing a 7-drop 5/5 with no effect, it can feel much less so. So if you're able to turn that Nord Firebrand in your hand to cashing in on the Savage Ogre value from the top of your deck, even if your opponent's cleared the board, that makes your deck, because of its potential to add more damage to creatures, much more threatening for your opponent. So Markarth Bannerman allows you to constantly have targets for those, so it's another one of those cards that your opponent's going to have to kill immediately. Blackworm Necromancer is a card that we've seen in a lot of these mid-range decks running Endurance, and for good reason, and in this deck it sort of just fits right at home, because like I said, every card is overstated, every card is just the biggest thing, the most value thing, the most punishing thing for anyone who's playing a slow game that you could possibly be playing on curve. So basically no matter what you get, besides maybe maybe an Iliac Sorcerer in some situations, or a Greystone Ravager in some situations. Basically, you're going to get something with a huge amount of value, and it's going to be very powerful. Gortwog, another 6-drop. Now this card is another one that might be considered too slow, especially in the current meta where things can race you, but I want another tool against aggro. I want another tool against those control decks, not particularly against aggro at all. And this is another one of those cards that if it's allowed to stick, and it's actually more likely to stick than something like a Markarth a lot of the time. If it's allowed to stick, this card is a surprisingly powerful effect because of the threat density of this deck. It can pull a Sentinel, and it can pull any number of the cards that actually buff things. It can pull Morgul Gatekeeper and Savage Ogre. These are very powerful pulls for the deck. It can pull Black Worm Necromancer and get things back from the graveyard. A lot of powerful summon effects in this deck, and if Gortwog's allowed to stick, it can often just carry a game by itself. So Stampede Sentinel is one of the cards I wanted to touch on because it's the new card, basically, the monthly card. And am I sure that it needs to be in this deck? Not entirely, but I have tested it and it's been pretty good. Obviously, this is just, it's a 6-drop 7/7, which is basically the best stats we can play on turn 6. I have Night Shadow up because I think this might be the most reasonable card to play instead of the Stampede Sentinel. I think this might fill another role in that it does help you more so against those other aggressive decks while still being relatively threatening against control, and they both have Breakthrough, which is kind of cool as well. 7/7, however, is one of the hardest. It's just so ridiculously hard to get rid of without a Javelin or Edict from a control deck. Of course, it can be shackled, and I mentioned that when I discussed the card by itself, but you can't even Lightning Bolt, Firebolt combo kill this card, so you need to have a targeted removal, and if you've been playing threats that might encourage your opponent to use one of those prematurely, Stampede Sentinel can come down and just be incredibly punishing. Also worth noting that it can single-handedly just win you the game if you happen to queue into Swindler's Market decks, as we found out in the video that I'll link at the end of this. So yeah, that's pretty cool. If you happen to be facing an influx of Swindler's Market decks, I don't know why exactly you would be, but yeah, totally reasonable. And I've heard people say replacements, of course, Night Shadow I just mentioned. I think someone also said they were playing Blood Dragon, and of course Blood Dragon, very value, obviously. Of course, the Stampede Sentinel has Breakthrough, Blood Dragon doesn't have Breakthrough, but Blood Dragon just ignores guards in the first place, and it has that 7 toughness that is just sort of the tipping point for things that are unreasonable to be removed, and it does come down even earlier, so that's something to consider. Perfectly reasonable. All of these cards are fine. Test to your heart's content, basically. Triumphant Jarl, don't really need to talk about it too much. Fantastic card to refill your hand. It's necessary 2 of, I think, in this deck just to fight those control decks, because if they do answer everything on curve, which is a tall order, you will want to refill your hand, and after that, when you start playing the second wave, so to speak, at that point in the game, that's going to be too much for your opponent to handle. And Savage Ogre is, I think, a very underappreciated card at the moment. Huge amount of burst coming from this card. Just knowing you have it in your deck, if your opponent knows the list, per se, they're going to just have to clear literally everything. And like I mentioned, the cards aren't particularly easy to clear either. You can also combo with an Iliac Sorcerer, which is not something that I was able to do. You have an Iliac Sorcerer on the board, though. Let's say you're at 8 Magicka. You can play the Savage Ogre, turn it into a 6/1, and then you can Rapid Shot it and turn it into a 12/1, and that's 12 damage all of a sudden. That was previously 1 damage, and that's a pretty gigantic amount of reach for a deck to have. Obviously, with the Markarth Bannerman, you always have potential target with charge in the deck if you're able to get 1 Markarth attack off. And this functions very well, very nicely with the Gortwog and the Black Worm Necromancer being able to play it from various parts of your deck. Gortwog can play it from your deck, Black Worm Necromancer can play it from the discard pile, and you can sort of get use out of the very powerful, one of the most powerful summon effects, I think, in the game. Definitely where this deck wants to cap off at its curve. Worth noting that Nogleave is a good inclusion against aggro as well for 7 drops, and also another very threatening card, so definitely consider including this at your 7 drop, maybe over the U-Shield, maybe over something else. Just test cards and see what's useful to you. Other inclusions, aggro still seems to be the most difficult matchup. Obviously, if you face an influx of control decks or action decks, Withered Hand Cultist could potentially come in. I just didn't feel like it was anything but redundant given the incredible 3 drops we have access to. If you want to fight aggro some more, Sharpshooter Scout, like I mentioned, is a fantastic choice. I initially included a Doomcrag Vampire, and I wanted to make use of sort of that with the Sharpshooters and maybe Iliac Sorcerer just to get by guards easily, but it felt clunky and unnecessary. So if you feel like including Sharpshooter, I would say just for the aggro matchups, that could potentially be reasonable. Skaven Pyromancer could also be potentially reasonable. Raiding Party could also be potentially reasonable. because Raiding Party is going to give you those extra Nords as well. These are potential aggro counters, I would say. I wouldn't say that you should include them if you're not worried about aggro. One other thing that I didn't include, but I think has been written off a bit too much recently, is Burn and Pillage. I think it might fit in this deck fine. I remember before it was nerfed, it was an inclusion in all of these aggressive mid-range warrior decks. So this card could potentially help you race if you're finding yourself in that situation a lot against other similar decks or even faster decks. They're probably going to commit to the lane that's not your lane, because while your cards may be slightly slower, they are going to be bigger, they're going to be less efficient for your opponent to trade into. You're going to be the one who's going to be happy with the trades, your opponent's not going to be happy with the trades, so maybe you're able to stick something huge like a Lumbering Ogrim after a Young Mammoth into the field lane, your opponent's just racing you in the shadow lane and threatening to win thanks to their Prophecy, aggro battle mage or something like that, then Burn and Pillage could turn the tides. So I do suggest experimenting with cards like that, and like I mentioned, Blood Dragon, all of these are fine inclusions if you're facing different things. A lot of things could fit into this deck, and it's still sort of in beta testing, just like the game. So that's cool as well. So if you're looking for a warrior deck, hopefully you'll consider it. Hopefully you enjoyed the analysis. Hopefully you will check out some gameplay videos with the deck. I encourage you to experiment with it. It's a fun deck. I've enjoyed it quite a lot, especially for these curve-based strategies. And basically just playing big creatures is a lot of fun. You get to beat your opponent down with them. So hopefully you've enjoyed. Feel free to like if you did. Subscribe to the channel for more strategy videos, deck techs, highlights, etc. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you guys next time.